Maine's rugged coastlines, deep forests, and hidden lakes hold more than natural beauty. They guard mysteries stretching back thousands of years, from strange runestones and ancient campsites to sacred legends and unexplained artifacts. These places blur the line between history and myth. Each site carries its own story, leaving us to wonder how much of Maine's past still lies untold. The Maine penny or Goddard coin. If you were to walk the quiet shoreline of Brooklyn, Maine today, you'd mostly see fishing boats, rocky beaches, and the steady rhythm of the Atlantic tides. It feels like a typical coastal town, far removed from anything you'd expect to connect with medieval Europe. But tucked into this unassuming landscape lies one of North America's strangest archaeological discoveries, a tiny coin known as the Maine penny, or the Goddard coin. On its own, it's just a piece of silver, not much larger than a dime. But when you look closer at where it came from, what it represents, and how it might have arrived here, the mystery grows into something almost unbelievable. The story begins in 1957, when archaeologists were excavating the Goddard site, a Native American settlement area in Brooklyn. This site had already yielded thousands of artifacts, projectile points, tools, pottery, and evidence of trade networks that stretched well beyond Maine. Among this collection of items, one object stood out sharply against the rest. It was a coin, old and weathered, with markings no one immediately recognized. For a while it was set aside, as so many strange finds are, with the assumption it must have been misplaced or misidentified. But later study revealed it was a silver penny, struck in Norway during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre, between 1065 and 1093 AD. That means the coin was minted around 1,000 years ago, at a time when the Norse were known to be voyaging west across the Atlantic. The timing is key. By the late 900s and early 1000s, Norse explorers like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson were pushing into Greenland and parts of Canada. Archaeological digs at L'Anse aux Faux Meadows in Newfoundland have proven that the Vikings made landfall in North America. But those settlements were relatively short-lived, and there's no accepted evidence that they ever traveled as far south as Maine. So how could a coin from Norway find its way into a native settlement on the Maine coast? One explanation often raised is trade. The Native Americans who lived at the Goddard site were active traders. Archaeologists have found evidence that goods from faraway places made their way into Maine through vast exchange networks. Items like copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the south, and stone from quarries hundreds of miles inland, all ended up here. It's possible then that the coin traveled hand to hand, moving through these networks long after its minting, eventually landing in the soil at Goddard. This idea doesn't require Vikings to have personally stood on Maine's shores. It simply means that something they once carried entered the web of trade that connected indigenous groups across the continent. But that explanation raises its own questions. Why would a coin be valuable to native traders who had no use for currency in the European sense? Was it treated as an ornament, a shiny piece of silver used for decoration? Or was it traded by weight of metal rather than as money? And if it was so easily passed along, why have no other Norse objects turned up in the region? The Maine penny remains the only confirmed Viking-era artifact ever found in the United States. That makes it either incredibly rare evidence of contact or a puzzling out-of-place object that somehow slipped through the cracks of history. Another explanation, though less accepted, is that Norse explorers may have traveled farther south than we realize. The sagas, those old Icelandic stories, described voyages to lands beyond Greenland, places with forests, grapes, and fertile soil. Some historians have speculated that these stories might describe areas of New England. If Norse explorers sailed down the coast, they could have landed in Maine, perhaps briefly, leaving behind a token like this coin. But there is no firm archaeological proof of such a visit. Unlike Newfoundland, where remains of Norse structures and tools clearly mark their presence, Maine has only this one coin. One object alone is a thin thread on which to hang the weight of an entire theory. Skeptics have also raised the possibility of a modern intrusion. Could the coin have been dropped by a collector, long after the time of Olaf Kyrre, and then accidentally mixed in with the site's ancient layers? This explanation seems less likely given the careful archaeological process, but it hasn't been ruled out completely. Human error, or even deliberate planting, has been known to cause confusion in digs before. The Maine penny has been tested and studied repeatedly, but the mystery isn't just about whether it's authentic, it's about the path it took to get where it was found. What makes the story compelling is not just the coin itself, but the context. The Goddard site shows evidence of vibrant native life stretching back thousands of years. It wasn't a small, isolated camp. It was a hub where people gathered, traded, and lived for centuries. Finding an object of European origin there, centuries before Columbus, speaks to the depth and complexity of ancient interactions across continents. Whether through direct contact or long chains of trade, it hints that the world was more connected than we might assume. Today, the Maine penny is housed at the Maine State Museum, where it's kept under controlled conditions. Visitors can see it on display, though it's easy to walk right past without realizing its importance. At first glance, it doesn't look like much, just a small weathered coin, but once you understand the debate around it, you see how it challenges the standard narrative of American history. Some people leave the museum excited, believing it proves Vikings reached much farther than previously thought. Others leave more skeptical, convinced that one coin isn't enough to rewrite the past. The site where it was found, the Goddard dig area in Brooklyn, isn't marked by grand monuments or ruins. It's mostly quiet land near the coast, the kind of place where you can hear seabirds and the slap of water against the rocks. Positively, this makes it a beautiful and peaceful location, a reminder of how ancient peoples might have thrived here with access to rich coastal resources. On the negative side, it means there isn't much physical evidence for visitors to connect with. Unlike sites where stone structures or burial mounds remain visible, the Goddard site doesn't give casual visitors much to see beyond the landscape itself. Its treasures are hidden away in museum collections, leaving the spot itself easy to overlook. In my own view, the Maine penny sits at the intersection of possibility and doubt. On one hand, it sparks the imagination, thinking about Norse explorers traveling farther than we thought, their ships cutting across the Atlantic, perhaps anchoring near Maine's rocky shores. On the other, I understand why scholars hesitate. One artifact, especially one so small and portable, is hard to use as proof of direct contact. For me, it's less about demanding a clear answer and more about appreciating how even a tiny object can remind us of how much we don't yet know. History isn't a closed book, it's full of missing pages, and sometimes a coin like this offers just a glimpse of what might be written there. As for the present, the Maine penny remains both protected and contested. The Goddard site is no longer an active excavation, so you can't go dig for treasures yourself, but the story continues to live on in the museum and in local lore. The positive side is that the coin is preserved, safe from damage, and accessible to the public. Anyone with curiosity can stand before it and wonder. The negative side is that without more discoveries to support its context, the coin feels lonely. An isolated clue without enough company to tell the whole story. And that's really where the mystery rests today. The Maine penny could be a relic of Viking contact, proof of long-distance trade, or just a misplaced artifact with a tangled history. Each theory holds weight, and none can fully dismiss the others. But in the end, whether you stand on the rocky coast of Brooklyn or in front of the museum glass in Augusta, the coin remains what it has always been, a small piece of silver that refuses to give up its secrets. Spirit Pond Runestones. On the rocky coast of Maine, not far from the small town of Phippsburg, 3 slabs of stone sparked one of the most heated debates in American archaeology. They are known as the Spirit Pond Runestones, and ever since their discovery in 1971, they've sat at the center of arguments about Vikings, hoaxes, and the blurry line between history and legend. To someone who first sees them, they might not look like much, just weathered stones covered in scratches. But those scratches are what give them their power. They're runes, the writing system used by Norse people 1,000 years ago, and if they are authentic, they could mean Vikings left their mark in Maine centuries before Columbus. The stones were first uncovered by a man named Walter Elliot, who stumbled across them near Spirit Pond, a quiet body of water surrounded by forest. Elliot wasn't an archaeologist, but he knew he had found something unusual. The 3 stones were of different sizes, but all carried inscriptions. 2 were smaller, with shorter carvings, while the largest one had lines of runes stretching across its face. When Elliot showed them to others, excitement spread quickly. Could this be the proof of Norse presence in New England that so many people had speculated about? The timing of the discovery was important. Just a few years earlier, in the 1960s, archaeologists had confirmed the Norse settlement at Lundsale Meadows in Newfoundland. That find proved beyond doubt that Vikings had reached North America, but how far they had gone was still an open question. The Spirit Pond stones seemed to suggest they might have made it at least as far south as Maine. To many, that possibility was thrilling. When scholars began to examine the stones more closely, though, the excitement turned into suspicion. Specialists in Old Norse and runic writing noticed that the inscriptions didn't perfectly match what would be expected from authentic Viking carvings. Some of the characters seemed copied from modern books about runes rather than from genuine medieval examples. The grammar also seemed inconsistent, almost as if someone had tried to mimic Old Norse without fully understanding it. This led many experts to declare the stones forgeries, created in modern times rather than by Norse explorers. Yet the story doesn't end there. Some researchers and enthusiasts continue to believe the Spirit Pond runestones are authentic. They argue that just because the inscriptions don't look perfect, doesn't automatically mean they're fake. After all, if Vikings were traveling in a strange land, far from home, it's possible their writing wouldn't strictly follow the rules we see in Scandinavia. Languages shift, and runes carved by explorers might reflect a less formal style. Others suggest that the stones might even represent a transitional form of writing, capturing a moment of linguistic change. Another point in favor of the stones, at least for believers, is the context of their discovery. Eliot wasn't known as a hoaxer, and the stones weren't dug up from a convenient backyard or roadside where planting them would have been easy. They were found in a natural setting near a pond, a place that doesn't immediately suggest someone trying to stage an archaeological prank. Supporters also point to the fact that Maine's coast would have been accessible to Norse sailors who were skilled at navigating long distances. If they reached Newfoundland, what's to say they couldn't have pushed farther down the coast? Still, the mainstream academic community has remained unconvinced. Most linguists and archaeologists consider the Spirit Pond runestones to be part of a long tradition of questionable Viking artifacts in North America. They place them alongside items like the Kensington runestone in Minnesota, another carved stone that some claim is Norse, but most experts reject. These debates often reveal just how much people want to connect their local history to something larger, something legendary. A genuine Viking inscription in Maine would rewrite the story of European contact with the continent, and that possibility continues to capture imaginations even if the evidence is shaky. Walking near Spirit Pond today, you wouldn't necessarily think of Vikings. The area is quiet, the pond still, and the trees rise around it in a way that makes the place feel almost untouched. The stones themselves are no longer out in the open. They've been moved for protection, because the elements and curious visitors were wearing them down. They're now housed at the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, where people can view them up close. Walking near Spirit Pond today, you wouldn't necessarily think of Vikings. The area is quiet, the pond still, and the trees rise around it in a way that makes the place feel almost untouched. The stones themselves are no longer out in the open. They've been moved for protection, because the elements and curious visitors were wearing them down. They're now housed at the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, where people can view them up close. On the positive side, this means they're safe from damage and preserved for future generations to study. Visitors get a chance to stand in front of them, trace the runes with their eyes, and imagine the possibility of Norse explorers in Maine. On the negative side, the relocation takes away some of the mystery of place. Seeing them in a museum case feels different from stumbling across them in the wild, where the thought of ancient hands carving those lines into stone feels more immediate. And because so many experts dismiss the stones as modern fakes, the museum doesn't treat them as evidence of Viking contact. Instead, they're presented more as curiosities, examples of how stories and controversy can shape our understanding of history. Personally, I find myself caught in the middle. Part of me leans toward the skeptical side. The runes really do look suspicious in places, and the arguments about grammatical mistakes are hard to ignore. If they are fakes, they fit into a long pattern of mysteries that turn out to be the product of someone's imagination. At the same time, I can't help but feel drawn to the possibility that they might be genuine. Standing in front of them, you can't help but think of a Norse traveler, far from home, carving words into stone beside a Maine pond. Even if it isn't true, the image sticks with you. And in a way, that's part of the power of mysteries like this. They force us to hold on to questions without clear answers. As for the present situation, the Spirit Pond runestones remain under debate, but no longer in the open air. The Maine Maritime Museum displays them for those curious enough to visit, and they still attract enthusiasts who argue passionately for their authenticity. The positive side is that the stones are preserved, safe from erosion and vandalism, and accessible to the public. The negative side is that they've been stripped of some of their atmosphere and mystery, and most academic voices continue to dismiss them outright. What's left is a stalemate, a set of stones that mean everything to some and nothing to others. In the end, the Spirit Pond runestones remind us of how fragile the line between history and myth can be. Whether they were carved by Norse explorers 1,000 years ago or by a modern hand with too much imagination, they've earned a place in Maine's story. They keep alive the possibility of forgotten journeys, hidden contacts, and lost histories. And maybe, just maybe, that's their real gift, not the certainty of an answer, but the enduring spark of curiosity. Sebasticook Lake Fishweir Complex. If you stand on the shores of Sebasticook Lake in Newport, Maine, it looks like a peaceful modern reservoir. Families fish from small boats, ducks drift across the surface, and in summer the water sparkles in the sun. But beneath those calm waves lies something astonishing, the remains of one of the oldest fishing systems ever built in North America. It's known as the Sebasticook Lake Fishweir Complex, and it stretches back thousands of years. Hidden under the water are wooden stakes and frameworks once used by Native Americans to trap fish on a massive scale. For archaeologists, it's like a time capsule of ingenuity and survival, offering a glimpse into how ancient communities thrived in a challenging environment. The discovery of the fishweirs came in the mid-20th century when water levels in the lake were altered by dam work. As the water receded, people noticed strange patterns of wooden stakes driven deep into the mud. At first, some thought they might be remnants of logging operations or millwork. After all, Maine has a long history of both. But closer study revealed they were much older, dating back as far as 3000 BCE. Radiocarbon testing confirmed that these weren't colonial remains, or even from the later native settlements. They were truly ancient. Fishweirs themselves are fairly simple in concept, but brilliant in practice. By arranging rows of wooden stakes and weaving brush between them, early people could create funnel-like barriers that guided fish into traps or enclosures. Instead of chasing fish one by one with spears or nets, entire schools could be directed into a confined space. This allowed communities to harvest large quantities of food efficiently, which was critical for survival, especially during seasonal runs when fish moved upstream in huge numbers. What's striking about the Sebasticook Lake system is its sheer scale. Hundreds upon hundreds of stakes were found, many of them still preserved because the mud kept out oxygen that would normally rot wood away. Archaeologists realized this wasn't a small casual setup made by one family. It was a coordinated effort, likely built and maintained by groups working together. The construction shows planning, cooperation, and knowledge passed down through generations. It wasn't just a tool, it was infrastructure, as vital to the people then as a bridge or road is to us today. The weirs also reveal how deeply ancient people understood their environment. They knew when fish would arrive, where they would swim, and how to build structures that worked with natural currents. In a way, it was an early form of engineering, blending technology with the rhythms of nature. It shows that native people in Maine weren't just surviving, they were thriving, building systems that allowed them to store food, support larger communities, and focus on other parts of life like toolmaking, art, and social exchange. Yet despite how impressive the Sebasticook Lake Fishweir Complex is, it also leaves us with many unanswered questions. For one, we don't know exactly which groups of people first built it. Recent discoveries in the Amazon rainforest have revealed complex geometric patterns visible only from above. These precisely aligned structures, dating back over 2,000 years, suggest ancient civilizations possessed sophisticated engineering knowledge that challenges our understanding of pre-Columbian societies. How did they achieve such precision? The fact that these were preserved at all feels almost accidental. A lucky break that lets us peek into the deep past. From a modern perspective, the fishweirs force us to rethink stereotypes about ancient life. Too often we imagine early Native Americans as constantly struggling against nature, living hand to mouth. The Sebasticook evidence paints a different picture of people who not only survived, but built lasting systems to ensure abundance. It shows a knowledge of ecology that was sophisticated, and it challenges us to see these communities as advanced in ways we don't always recognize. Visiting Sebasticook Lake today, though, you won't see the fishweirs themselves. They remain submerged beneath the water, invisible to the casual eye. That's both a positive and a negative. On the positive side, the mud and water keep them preserved, hidden from vandals or souvenir hunters. On the negative side, it means there's little for the average visitor to experience directly. Unlike a stone ruin or burial mound, there's no dramatic landmark to point to. The story exists mostly in archaeological reports and museum exhibits, which can make it harder for people to connect emotionally with the site. The lake itself has its own challenges. Like many bodies of water in Maine, it has faced issues with pollution, algae blooms, and invasive species. These problems affect water clarity and quality, and they threaten the preservation of what lies beneath. If the ecosystem shifts too much, the delicate balance that has kept the ancient wood intact for thousands of years could be disrupted. That adds urgency to ongoing efforts to study and protect the fishweirs before natural or human changes erase them. From my own perspective, the Sebasticook Lake Fishweir Complex is one of those quiet mysteries that deserves more attention. It doesn't have the drama of a stone circle or a gold treasure, but it tells a story that's just as powerful. To me, it's humbling. It makes me think about how people thousands of years ago faced the same basic challenges we do. How to eat, how to support a community, and they came up with solutions that were clever, sustainable, and effective. At the same time, I understand why it doesn't capture the public imagination in the same way as something like the Maine penny or a runestone. Without a visible monument, it's easy for people to overlook, but maybe that's part of its quiet strength. It reminds us that history isn't just in flashy discoveries, but in the everyday ingenuity that kept people alive. As for the present situation, Sebasticook Lake continues to serve as both a natural resource and a reminder of deep history. On the positive side, local efforts to improve water quality are ongoing, and awareness of the archaeological treasures beneath is growing. The Maine Archaeological Society and other groups have worked to document the fishweirs so their story isn't lost. On the negative side, the lake's environmental struggles and the invisibility of the site mean it risks fading from memory, treated as just another fishing spot rather than the home of one of the oldest engineering projects in North America. In the end, the Sebasticook Lake Fishweir complex stands as both a mystery and a lesson. We don't know exactly who built it first, how many generations relied on it, or how it fit into the larger network of ancient life in New England, but we do know it represents intelligence, cooperation, and resilience. It shows that thousands of years ago, on the same shores where people now cast fishing lines for recreation, communities were building the foundations of survival in ways that still impress us today. And while the wooden stakes may stay hidden underwater, the story they tell rises above the surface, urging us not to forget. Vail Site. In the far north of Maine, where the forests thicken and the land feels almost untouched by time, there lies a site that quietly reveals one of the earliest chapters of human life in this region. Known as the Vail Site, it doesn't look like much to the casual eye. There are no ruins, no stone walls, and no monuments standing tall. Yet beneath the soil, archaeologists uncovered evidence that pushes human history in Maine back nearly 13,000 years. To put that in perspective, people were camping and hunting here while glaciers still lingered in parts of North America. That kind of time frame is hard to wrap your head around. It means the Vail Site belongs to the very earliest wave of Paleo-Indian settlement on the continent. What made the discovery so striking was the scale of the occupation. In the 1970s, when the site was excavated, researchers found not just a handful of artifacts, but a full campsite spread out across an ancient glacial lakebed. There were at least 8 separate areas where families had built shelters, lit fires, and prepared food. Alongside these living spaces were hundreds of stone tools, the kind of sharp fluted spear points that Paleo-Indian hunters are famous for. The sheer number of them suggested this wasn't a one-time stop, but a place people came back to season after season. The Vail Site is most closely tied to the caribou. Archaeologists believe this was a major hunting camp, perfectly placed to intercept migrating herds as they moved across the open landscape that once stretched here. You have to picture Maine at that time, not as dense forest, but more like tundra, sparse trees, sweeping fields, and long views of herds moving along the ridges. Hunters at Vail would have had to be highly skilled, tracking the animals, setting up ambushes, and coordinating hunts that involved dozens of people. The tools they left behind tell that story. Fluted points were designed to pierce deeply into tough hides, and their precision is still admired today. Holding one in your hand, you'd see the same sharp ridges and careful shaping that speaks to both craftsmanship and survival. What we can't see as clearly are the human details. Who were these people? How did they speak? What stories did they share around their fires? The artifacts give us only glimpses. The 8 campsites hint at family groups working together. The fire pits show they cooked their meals here. The stone flakes scattered around suggest younger hunters or tool makers learning by practice. It's an outline of a community frozen in time, but without the voices to fill in the lines. Another mystery is where these hunters fit in the broader story of migration. The tools at Vail connect to the Paleo-Indian traditions seen in other parts of North America, including the famous Clovis culture, but they aren't identical. Some points from Vail show a distinct style, suggesting that these people were already adapting, shaping their technology to fit their environment. That matters because it shows cultural diversity at an early stage. Instead of one uniform way of life spreading everywhere, people were experimenting, creating regional traditions suited to their own landscapes. I think what makes the Vail Site compelling is how ordinary it looks today. If you walk there now, you'd see forest and quiet water, maybe the rustle of animals in the brush. Nothing about it screams ancient history, and yet beneath that surface, some of the earliest footprints in Maine were made. It reminds you how much of human history is hidden, waiting quietly for someone to look closely enough. There are positives about what the site has given us. It proved that humans were in northern New England far earlier than many had assumed. It showed that Paleo-Indian hunters weren't just wanderers but had organized, strategic ways of living tied to specific landscapes. And it gave us a more complete picture of how adaptable humans are, capable of thriving in a climate that was still raw and harsh after the Ice Age. On the negative side, very little of the site is visible today, and that makes it easy to overlook. Unlike a stone circle or a mound that stands out in the landscape, the Vail Site is mostly gone, its artifacts moved to museums for study. Without that physical presence, it doesn't capture the imagination of visitors in the same way. There's also the risk of forgetting it altogether, of letting it fade into academic texts rather than keeping it alive in public memory. From my perspective, I see both sides. I wish more of the site could be experienced directly, but I also respect the decision to protect it and preserve its artifacts. For me, the power of the Vail Site comes from knowing that even in a quiet stretch of Maine woods, people once built their lives with skill and purpose. It doesn't need dramatic ruins to feel meaningful. Its value is in the reminder that human history is much deeper here than most people realize. As for the present situation, the Vail Site itself isn't open as a tourist stop. It sits in Maine's wilderness, part of the landscape used by hunters, canoeists, and hikers. The good side of that is that it remains relatively undisturbed, protected by remoteness. The downside is that without interpretation or access, it risks being forgotten outside of archaeology circles. Still, the story endures through the artifacts kept in institutions and the research that continues to shape our understanding. In the end, the Vail Site may never be a popular destination, but its quiet presence carries a weight. It shows that even in the toughest conditions, people were here, carving out life on the edge of an ice-scarred world. And when you stand in those woods today, it's humbling to realize just how far back that story goes. Pamola. High in the wilderness of northern Maine, where the forests stretch endlessly and the winds sweep over rocky summits, there is a mountain that has stirred awe and fear for centuries. Mount Katahdin, the state's tallest peak, is not only a natural landmark, but also a spiritual heart of Wabanaki legend. At the center of these stories is Pamola, a fearsome spirit who guards the mountain. He's described as part man, part moose, and part bird, a creature with a human body, the head of a moose, and the wings and talons of a giant bird of prey. It's a strange and unsettling image, and it carries a message. This mountain was not meant to be taken lightly. For the Penobscot people, Pamola wasn't simply a monster, he was a powerful being tied to the land and sky. He was believed to control storms and the harsh weather that often lashes Katahdin. If lightning struck or snow fell suddenly, it wasn't just chance, it was Pamola's doing. In that sense, the spirit symbolized both danger and respect. The mountain was his domain, and those who dared to climb it risked angering him. This belief created a boundary, a kind of sacred protection that kept the peak off limits. Long before recreational hiking and mountaineering, Katahdin was viewed as a place where spirits dwelled, not humans. When you think about the setting, it makes sense why such a legend took shape. Katahdin rises abruptly out of Maine's forested landscape. Its granite ridges often cloaked in cloud. Storms can appear suddenly, even in summer, and the weather is unpredictable. To a people living close to the land, it must have seemed natural to explain these dangers through a guardian spirit. Pamola wasn't just a warning, he was an embodiment of the mountain's raw power. The legend also shaped behavior. The Penobscot avoided climbing to the summit, considering it taboo. Even venturing too close was said to bring bad luck. At the same time, Pamola was not entirely seen as an enemy. Some stories describe him as a spirit who could be approached, even bargained with, though always with caution. There are tales of hunters who sought his favor, asking for success, but these interactions were rare and dangerous. In a way, the legend reflects a balance. Humans could live in the shadow of Katahdin, but the peak itself belonged to something greater. As European settlers and later American explorers arrived, they heard these stories and recorded them, though often in simplified or distorted ways. Pamola's image became part of Maine folklore, sometimes treated as a scary campfire tale, other times as a symbol of the wilderness itself. In the 1800s, when writers like Henry David Thoreau visited Katahdin, they too remarked on the aura of the place, though Thoreau described it in terms of sublime nature rather than spirits. He was sensing the same power that had inspired the legend. Today, Pamola lives on in more than just stories. His name has been given to trails, shelters, and even a brewery. Hikers who tackle Katahdin often hear about him, usually framed as a local myth, a colorful piece of history to add to the experience. But there's still something unsettling about the idea when you stand on the peak and the wind tears past you. The cliffs drop away sharply, the weather shifts in minutes, and you can feel exposed in a way that makes the legend seem not so far-fetched. The mystery lies in what Pamola represents. Was he ever thought of as a literal creature, or was he always a spirit, a symbol of the forces people couldn't control? That's hard to pin down. For the Penobscot, the line between the physical and the spiritual wasn't the same as it is in modern Western thought. Spirits were part of the landscape. They weren't myths in the sense of distant stories. They were present, real, and active. Pamola, then, was less about belief in a monster and more about recognition of power. There are positives to the way this legend endures. It keeps alive part of Wabanaki tradition, reminding people that Katahdin was sacred long before it became a state park or a hiking destination. It also gives visitors a sense of humility. The mountain isn't just another peak to conquer, but a place that demands respect. From my perspective, I think Pamela's story deserves to be taken seriously. Not literally, perhaps, but seriously as a reflection of how people understood their world. Standing on Katahdin, you can feel why such a legend grew. The mountain dominates the horizon, unpredictable and untamed. If you've ever been caught in a sudden storm up there, you know the feeling of being at the mercy of something much bigger than yourself. I don't see Pamola as a monster to fear, but as a reminder that humans aren't the masters of every place. Some landscapes still belong to the wild. As for the present situation, Mount Katahdin is now part of Baxter State Park, carefully managed to balance conservation and recreation. Thousands of hikers make the climb each year, tracing routes that cut across the rugged ridges. On the positive side, this protects the land from development, keeping the mountain wild and accessible for future generations. The negative is the sheer number of visitors, which puts strain on trails and erodes some of the solitude the place once had. For the Penobscot, Katahdin remains sacred, and there are ongoing efforts to honor that connection. The legend of Pamola lingers in this balance, hovering between cultural heritage and outdoor adventure. And when the clouds gather suddenly around the peak, it's easy to imagine the Great Spirit still watching, reminding us that not every summit is ours to claim without consequence.